welcome. Day 22, we are going to select to possess. I've put myself out here in the pyramid desert at dusk. We're going to select an object to possess its physics here. And then as we fly along, we're using the index trigger of our right controller to kind of control its physics and make this little game where we try to land it up here on the pyramid. And if I succeed, oh, got it stuck. So it's basically wherever I'm pointing my controller, my right controller, that angle, I'm going to inject a little bit of a pulse of physics, a little physics impulse, and it's going to be the amount of impulse is relative to how tightly I squeeze that trigger. You can see it actually jumping in the background. You can see the amount that I'm depressing the index trigger. And I've got actually a spatial quote-unquote trigger above that top pyramid box over there. So I've got a little setup here where I can select a box and then I can control its physics using my index trigger and point whichever direction I'm pointing. I can get I'm going to put the force in that direction, and so every frame while I'm holding down that index trigger, I'm applying a force in the position that I'm rotating. So if I go that way, or if I'm rotated that way, or back towards me. And so it's a combination of squeezing this trigger and aiming. So I'm sort of flying this object, possessing kind of its physics, right? And then in my left hand, I've got the default kind of fly mechanic. And so kind of combining those, I can it takes a little coordination, but as I kind of just get the balance right, the amount of force right, I can kind of fly along and guide this thing. And try to get it to land up there. If I get it to land on the top one, I've got a particle emitter, the default fire that's childed to this box. We learned about childing particle emitters to mesh entities and then like emitting from their surface. And so this is kind of cool. It's a basic. It's kind of a nice like way to get you started on sort of like selecting objects in the world and then doing something to that particular one, right? So I can select, and then I'm possessing that one for the time being. And this is kind of the basic type of interaction. I mean, the mechanic of the behavior of selecting an object and then doing something to it is the perfect setup for many different ways you might want to interact with objects in your space. It turns out to be a little more difficult, but this is pretty fun. I would love to set up just continuing this out and set up a timer out here, a scoring system, and kind of use this as maybe I can only possess them for so long, or I only get so much possession power or something, like a total amount of force that I can actually inject into them, so I can't have it wander off for too long. So I have to be very very smart in the way that I aim it. And so yeah, even if you sit here and play for a little bit, you can kind of realize that I can set it up kind of like almost like basketball, right? Like I just get my trajectories kind of and the amount that I press kind of set up. Becomes pretty fun to just use those. So let's break this apart. I'll explain some of it while we're looking at it. Basically, the first thing, the primary elements of this are the ability to have this global understanding of the selected item. So, and the selected item keeps changing, and so I'm using my grip trigger to select. So that interaction of setting a selection of I am now the I am now this, this box is selected, now it's this box. So changing out the quote-unquote selected item is one of the key features here. The second one is, so now that we have a selected item, and say it's this one, we now need to know the direction of the direction of kind of the pointer. And in this case, it's going to be our, it's our right-hand controller, so that's the direction, so that we can put an impulse in it. Then we need to know when to start putting impulses in, and we need to know how much impulse to put in. And so those are the main kind of variables. It's like which object is the selected object, what direction do I want to send it, and how much do I want to send it in that direction. And that's pretty much it. And if you kind of just, right now I'm actually just holding down the index trigger just ever so slightly, and if I get it just right, I can get kind of almost a perfect hover. But it's not simple. It's not immediately perfectly simple, but come on, one more fire. Boom. Okay, so let's dive in and look at the script on this. So here's our setup. We basically have our sunset-y pyramid world, and we've got a bunch of objects which are just clones of the same initial box. We'll call these possessible boxes. These possessible boxes here are all clones from an original one. So everything, these are basically all the same for the most part. And I'm going to turn the VR rig off for a second so you don't see the lasers zooming around. These, excuse me. I'll stop also rendering the, I don't actually need to play. So these are all just, these are just part of the level, part of the world here, part of the scene. These just make kind of a pyramid upon which to kind of deliver my thing. And so this trigger up here, this box that's called a trigger, this is this box up here is the one that has the fire underneath it, which has its area's use parent surface is set to true so that it emits that burst off a surface. And this trigger, basically, if I just get any one of these possessible boxes into this zone, the fire bursts. And that's a very simple piece of code. This is basically this trigger goes and gets its parent, get parent node, then it finds a child node, one of its siblings, by name, and it goes and gets fire, and then it runs a function on a particle emitter, this one fire, and it emits a burst of 500 particles. So that's kind of the success fire burst. The other thing that we have is basically each of these boxes is interactable, as we've done in tutorials past in the 30 Days of Symmetry. Here on the 22nd day, you should be pretty familiar with adding this interactable attribute. When we build this from scratch, we're going to be doing that. Basically, when you press this box with the grip trigger for the interaction, on the grip trigger of the VR rig, it runs the press event, which is basically just tells this this global script we're about to look at. It says, "Hey, I want to be the object to move." So set the global script's object to move property, or set that variable. Set it to self. Set it to me. Make it me. So whenever you click it, it's going to set this global variable of some object that is the one to move. And so this global script then is basically the one that we're running, and we could call this possession manager. That would be fine. But I just left it as a global script. And if we look at what's inside of it, we basically have a few things. This overall concept of the direction that we're going to move, this overall concept of the object to move. That's where this box, when we clicked it, it told this script that I want to be that box. This is just the initialization of setting the kind of initial entities that are going to be. It sets an initial value for the direction, and it sets an initial value for the or actually, sorry, it just sets an initial value for this object to move, and it tells us which item is going to be our pointer. That's the pointer, the direction that you're going to move. The pointer that points in the direction that this object is, the possessed object is going to move in. Then on every frame, we basically go and we look at that pointer, that object that is the pointer, and we get its forward z direction, its get world look at direction, and that's then the direction that we're going to apply. That's then the direction that we're going to apply the physics forces on that object. So now, because every frame we're changing the direction, but not every frame are we changing the object. We only change the object when we press an object over here. So that's why the object to move, the possessed object, gets changed from a press event on each of the objects. That's why that lives on the object. So when you clone it out, each one of them says, "Hey, if I'm pressed, go talk to the global, script kind of managing all of this and update me." But direction happens in this function called onTick, and onTick happens every frame. On a knit happens at the very first, pre-frame. So as soon as you press play, this all runs once. On a knit runs once, and then the script onTick runs every frame, and in VR that's 90 frames a second. The other thing to know about init is if you're editing during playtime, if you're editing the script during playtime, onNit will run again. It also, if you clone an object from an emitter or some other way that you put an object into the space and there's an onInit function, that also, it runs the very first frame of the object getting initialized. Just to know. But this is where you kind of set up your initial conditions and name kind of some initial variables, like the pointer, the thing that's going to point. That's not ever going to change, and so then onTick runs every frame, and we update the direction that we're looking at on every frame. And then we have one other thing that we're doing, which is calling this impulse function. This is one that I set up here, and we create an amount, and we multiply the amount by the direction. The direction is set again back in this other function each frame, and we're multiplying by some amount. And to do that, we have one other thing going on, and I did it here in the terrain space. There's a couple of ways we can do it, but I have bound a little function that calls this function over to this one, and that's a continuous button press on a player controller added to the terrain space. So this is the way we're going to kind of set this up, so let's so basically over here in the player controller, we'll do just one more kind of unpacking here. There's a function. We added a player controller just to the terrain space, and there's a function that is a continuous button input, which is bound to our VR controller's right index trigger. The name is called possess, and we look at the function under onPossess. All it does is go and call the global script and pass in the float value 0, and then this is a float, like decimal value from 0 to 1 of how much we're pressing the index trigger. So it basically calls the global script's impulse and hands it this f value. So if you come back and look at the global script, it has an impulse and takes in that f value, and then it uses that f value to scale the amount of force that we're applying to the object to move. So it all boils down, after all of this, it all boils down into this one final line, which is the self.object to move. That's the object that we've selected in the space. We go and we get its rigid body, its physics representation. We apply a central impulse to it, and we make it the direction that we are pointing the pointer, which is, in our case is our right-hand controller, or something on our right-hand controller. And then we're multiplying it by this thing called amount, which just scales the amount. And that amount value is also scaled by the amount that we're pressing. It's kind of a combination of this. The amount that we press our trigger, our right controller's trigger from 0 to 1, how much we hold that index trigger down, 0 to 1, and then this other little variable, which is just kind of scaling it for our user experience here. If we want this to be really light and easier to control, we would probably make this number a little smaller. We have to make it a certain amount to be able to get these objects off the ground, but if there was no gravity, we would probably also want this to be a little smaller. Yeah, so this value right here is just sort of to our taste. And then this is in real time, how much are we pressing down the controller. So so this is kind of cool, and you could also set up you could change like gravity. You could actually potentially change gravity dynamically and make the game even more challenging, with like winds kind of taking place. Yeah, so let's build this from scratch. I'm just going to save it where it's at, and we will build this up from scratch. And then put us back into a horizon space that looked like that. We're going to go to both pyramids, summer dusk, and I'm going to change the time of day to be just a little bit less, kind of like just a little more glow. So what we're going to do is start off with our possession box, and we'll build the sort of the target, the goal, the pyramid, or whatever here at the end. So let's see if we can get our box to behave the way that we want. So the first thing we're going to do, let's just make the box, I don't know, it really doesn't matter, but just maybe for simplicity's sake, we'll make it, make the size, make it shape 1 unit in every direction. There's really no reason to that. I'm just sort of like, let's work with a perfect cube. Okay, the object sits here, and what we want to do is when I press it, I want to tell that global script kind of manager that I am the one that should be pressed. So let's set up that global script manager. So what you're going to do in your library is basically right click, hit script, and you're going to create a new global script. And we'll just go ahead for habit, a good habit. We'll call this possession manager. I think that's the proper spelling. I should know that. Possession. I don't say possessions. Someone correct me. Possess. Anyway, we'll call it this. A global script comes in with these default values. It gives you an example, kind of shows you how you need to define things. What we're going to do is set up some above variables here, and then we're going to declare a few functions in here. So we don't want this add to score, and we don't really want to get score, but those are good examples. Let's go to the events on our possession manager. Let's go to on init and bring that in, and then on tick as well. So the first thing we want to do is declare the, there is an object to emit, and we want to set up a default one to, an object to possess. And so I'll go ahead and call it object to possess equals, and I'm just going to put it in an empty table up here, and then on the initialization, I'm going to say I'm basically going to say self. Actually, first I want to bring in this box. I'm going to make this one the default one. So I'm going to bring in the box here. So the box entity, I've just dragged in its icon onto the script. And so I'm going to make the box entity the object to possess is going to be equal to this box entity. So this is on the very first frame. This is setting the initial default object, so that our object to possess is that box entity, which means that, just to test that this is true, on every frame, let's print, let's print self, sorry, this needs to be self, self.object to possess equals box entity. And we're going to print self.object to possess colon get name. So that's the name of this object. And so if we've set this correctly, self.object possess equals box entity. So that means that the box entity that we brought in, this box entity, is going to be the first item set as object to possess. So we self.object to possess references this. We fill it with the box entity. Basically, we call it, and that means the box entity is going to be that. And then that happens on initialization. And then on our first tick and every tick after that, we're going to print the name of our self.object to possess. And if we've done it correctly, we should start printing box entity down here, which it does, which you can see. Great. So we at least have something that's going to be our first object to possess. And so how do I, if I make a second one of these, how can I change how can I change and update this object to possess to be me the object? So what we're going to do in our box is we'll close the global script from now. If we on the box, we want to make sure that this thing is selectable and interactable. So we've been doing this quite a bit. To do that, we go to the box entities properties, and under here, this little add attribute, little triangle right here, is we're going to add interactable attribute. And under the interactable, we have on press, and this on press event is what we want to use to run the script to update our possession manager. So now we can have one script talk to another, which is kind of the base, one of the best parts of this tutorial is getting one script to go over and talk to another script, so that when that other script runs, it's now updated from my new one, and now we can start to get really a little bit more layered complexity in our interactions. And so what we're going to do is go and talk to this possession manager. So to do that, I'm going to drag that possession manager into this script window, which then allows me to reference it directly and any of its objects. So let's go back and remind ourselves. If I edit that code for a second, we have an object called object to possess on it. We have a so this is a member variable, and what I need to do is change this. And so so when I'm over in the box, let's go ahead and hit the on press event, or we can hit edit code on our box. I need to write the possession manager script, that global script dot object to possess. Okay, so that's the thing I'm going to change. It's this variable I need to access. So I need to basically, I can just copy this, and what I'm going to do is come over to my box and hit edit code over there. So it's called possession manager in this scope on this event. So possession manager is referencing this script, and so we just need to add its dot object to possess needs to be us, needs to be self, which references this entire box entity. And so now if I add another one and it has that same script on it, both of these boxes, I've just held down Alt and shift dragged it over to the side. I now have 3 boxes, and each one of them has an on press. Each one of them is interactable. Each one has an on press event, and each one of them goes and gets this global possession manager, and then relatively says set me to be the object to possess. Perfect. So we should be able to then select these with our mouse, and when we go into VR, it works the same with the laser. And we'll do these press events. So let's take a look. What I want to do is, we'll see this work if I put that code back in print, and I'll just leave this in here. Object to possess get name. So we should be printing on every frame. Excuse me. Yep. In here, I need to call self dot object to possess, because the object is not object to possess doesn't live inside this scope. It lives at the global scope. So I need to say, look at my overall, look at the self and my dot object to possess. So let's take a look. So we're calling box entity copy. This should be box entity copy 2, copy 2, nothing, or box entity copy 2. Perfect. So we've successfully set up this kind of switcherooski, this little switching manager, and I can comment now. I can comment this out with 2 hyphens. I'm going to mark this code so that we can use it to test if we should want later on. I can also delete these comments up here. Those are just sort of like instruction lines. So now we have an object, and we need the object, we need the direction to send it, and then we need to run the, figure out how we're going to inject those impulses. So let's figure out our direction, and basically we need to pull the direction from some object that is dynamic. And so you could put an object in the space. I actually started that way. I put some object in the space and then just kind of move the object around. But since we're going to build this for VR, that we're going to either want it to be some object that we can grab and move around, like a grabbable fixed object like we did with our UI panels last week, or we can just make it our right hand. So if we're flying with our left hand in VR, we can just make it our right hand. And so what we need to do on initialization is define that object in the space from which we're going to derive our direction. So let's set that up. Oops, what'd I do? Interesting. I accidentally dragged this onto there. Doesn't want that. So let's we're gonna need to now bring in our VR rig, which is a great time to bring it in now. I've got my headset hanging off my chair. I've got controllers kind of miscellaneously placed, but the important thing is that the VR rig will be facing forward towards these boxes, and if I point the VR headset forward, we can get a sneak preview that yes, indeed, forward. We'll look at these boxes, and we're good. So I'm just going to position the VR rig here for now, kind of off to the side, just off to the left, so I can kind of manipulate these boxes. So we need to define the object that is the kind of the pointer. And so if I double click the possession manager, I'll get the script open again. Let me expand it here. So what I want to do is basically say that I want the right hand to be the pointer. And what I'm going to do is just drag the right hand of the VR rig icon right here, right hand. I'm going to drag that right hand into the onInit function, and I can basically say self.pointer equals right hand. And now what I can do, so I now have a variable that I can reach to, since I've called it self.pointer equals our right hand object. I can now go and get a hold of the right hand location, its rotation, and use that as my rotation. And I'll show you. So the rotation is going to change every frame. It's going to change on tick. So why don't we on tick, we're going to change a direction value. So we need a direction value, and I'm just going to call it, let's call it dir. And to begin with, dir is going to just be a blank vector 3. It's going to be vector 3. And I'm just going to put 0, 0, 0 in it. And then down on tick, I'm going to say that self.dir, because I'm down in this space, I have to call it self.dir to update this dir. Self.dir is going to be equal to self.pointer, that's the right hand, colon, get world look at dir. And the world look at dir, jump out of VR for a second because I'm going to press F1. The get world, oh, there it is. Sorry. Just opened 3 of them. I pressed F1 over get world look at dir to bring up the symmetry docs. That's on any node you can call get world look at dir, and that's the forward Z direction of that object. There's also world right dir and world up dir, which means that the direction that I am pointing that my controller, the right hand, the direction that my controller is pointing is going to be the world look at dir. So I can basically say self.dir equals this pointer, my right hand's world look at dir. And let's just go ahead and let's print, and I'll call it toString. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm just going to print self.dir. But I'm going to put that in a string here. Print toString, which stringifies this, and we'll print that. Let me turn VR back on. I'm going to grab my right controller, and you can see it there in the space kind of moving around. And the values are updating over here on the left. Maybe this is a little better. So you can see those values then are changing when I move my right hand, which is great. Which means we're constantly updating our dir value, which means that I can go and whenever I go and grab this from another function, which we're about to create, which is the impulse function, I am gonna have a constantly. I'm gonna have a dynamic, a variable dir that's based on my hand, and that's all we needed to do in the onTick event is just update, go and look at our hand, get its world look at dir, and then set our overall dir to be that we can access our kind of our global variable of dir that we can then go and get into an impulse function. Okay, so we've selected an object, we know the direction we want to send it, and now we just need to figure out how we're going to activate a function that sends it. So what we could do is just we could just create one single impulse, like one shot, one shock of large force, or we could create a really small force and do it every frame, and do it like 90 frames a second in VR. So we make a really small force, but have it updating constantly, which I think is more exactly what you need to possess something. If you're possessing something, it's not like you just fire it from a rubber band. It's that you actually control it kind of constantly. So to possess it, we need to basically run like a pressing event. And so what I did was to set up a kind of a global event on the terrain space using a player controller. There's kind of a couple ways we might do this. Let me see here. Right hand, index trigger. So I'm going to attempt to do it this way. I'm pretty sure that I should succeed here on pressing. So what we're going to do is on the right hand of our VR rig, we are going to, as you know, in our VR rig from an interaction standpoint, we put in the VR rig preset, and on the preset rig, that VR preset rig under the left hand, I'll expand these. It has the interact, the kind of the generic interact on its grip trigger, and it has interact on its grip trigger of its right hand. That's the same as the mouse click in essence. It's this overall interact, which creates an on press and on pressing, or a basically the on press, pressing, and release is what interact will involve. So we're using interact on the left and the right hand. Interact is going to be what selects the box. To possess the box, I want to use an empty different button, and I'm going to use the empty index trigger on my right hand. The left hand index trigger on the default rig is set to the fly node, which has us moving the VR rig and moving us in the VR experience around. And so I have one in this structure. I have one free button that I can use. Also, the index trigger in particular has the qualities of being kind of a continuous button press that sends a repeated float value, a 0 to 1 value, into the system, whereas a grip trigger, it's more like on or off. It's kind of a binary. Whereas an index trigger, I can control the overall kind of value, and this then gives you the effect when you're possessing it, like I was saying in the beginning, to press it with a certain amount. And so what we're going to do is use this index trigger as our on the right hand as our sort of possession activator. So to do that, what we want to do is open up our VR rig like I have here, select the index trigger node, and what you're going to want to do it won't have this by default. You're going to want to come onto the index trigger and go to add interactable, which will give you these events here. And what we're going to do is click the on pressing event. So while we press our index trigger, for each frame, we're going to run a function here. And what I'm going to do is run a function here that calls a function back in the possession manager. And we're going to pass to it this thing called val. And so the way that this will work is we sort of have to kind of go back and forth a little bit. So the possession manager is going to need to have that function ready for you. And we'll set it up right now, and it's going to be called function. We'll just call it impulse, and it'll be lowercase I impulse function. Excuse me, I need to type function global script, just like it is above. Function global script colon, and I'm going to say impulse, and then open close parenthesis. When I hit enter, we get this auto population of this word end. And in here, this is where we're going to begin to do the impulse. It's basically we're going to combine. I'll write a note of what we're going to do here. We're going to impulse our object to possess in our updating direction by a variable amount. So those are the three variables that we're going to combine. We're going to combine an amount, which is going to come from our index trigger, a direction, which is going to come from our right hand, and a selection, which has come from our interaction with those objects. And so over in the other one, we're going to call this, and we're going to pass in a thing called value. And I'll just call this val. This is going to take in the value of our index trigger, and that's all it really needs. Everything else it's going to grab. It's going to grab self.dir, and it's going to grab self.object to possess. Okay, so back over here on our on-press event, on our interactable, no, I'm sorry, excuse me, to call that, to call the possession manager's impulse function, we're going to do it from our index trigger on our right hand. So index trigger right hand, we're going to edit that code. And we have this on pressing event. So what we need to do to call that function is drag the possession manager into this function. So now we have possession manager colon, and what did we call it? Impulse. And we pass into it a value, which on our on pressing event, one of the things that we know on pressing is val is directly related to the amount that we're pressing in the index trigger. So it's 0 if you're not, well, it's just over, you know, it's like 0.1 or whatever when you just start to press it, and when you fully depress the index trigger on your VR controller, this value is going to go up to about 1. Sometimes it's 0.99, and if it's the index trigger, it's going to ramp up. If it's your grip trigger, it's going to basically jump from 0 to 1. If it's your index trigger, it's going to, you know, follow variable to how much you're squeezing it. So that's a good value that we can pass directly into our impulse function back on the possession manager. So that's essentially all we should need to do, because every time we run this function, it's going to go over and run this other function. This is going to run, on pressing, will run every frame while you're holding down the index trigger. So then if we come back over to possession manager, edit its code, that means that this impulse function will run every time I'm pressing that right-handed index trigger. Great. So we are now coming up to the finish line roughly, which is that we want to, on every frame, send this thing in a direction. So what we're going to do is say self dot object to possess colon get rigid body open close parentheses. That gets the physics representation. Now we're going to apply a central impulse, and this needs a vector 3, and we just happen to have a really great vector 3, which is self.dir, which is going to be self.dir, which gives us access to this, which we know because we watched it print is getting updated on every tick, which is coming from our right hand. Awesome. Self.dir, and that should send it in the direction of our right hand. And then we should be scaling this by some amount. We want to make sure we're at least scaling it by value. That's 0 to 1 based on how much we're pressing. So let's just multiply it by val and see if we like that, or if we want to kind of set some other kind of scale that amount as well. So let's see if it all works. I'm sure it'll never work on the first time. I'm not that great of a programmer. I should have error after error here. I've selected it successfully, I think. And I am, okay, maybe I'm lucking out. Yes. So I'm pressing the right index trigger. And actually, this is quite a good amount of, so you can see that I'm sort of, I've half depressed it. And you could change, of course, the mass, which, you know, you could either scale this thing with the mass or you could change the mass. I kind of like this. So we have successfully gotten these objects to be selectable, to update this global who's going to get possessed. Then we have a function that lives over on our right hand index trigger, which points, which fires the function and passes in its value. It fires in this function, this impulse function, and passes in this value, and then that impulse goes in the direction of wherever this hand is pointing, which is updating constantly. Super cool. Just for that should set you up to basically clone out. Oops, I grabbed a VR rig there. To clone out, you know, a bunch of these boxes that you can then kind of you can work to possess. I'm going to add a little bit of oomph to my flying. So under the VR rig, under the index trigger on the left hand, I'm going to edit the code of my oops, I locked it. Unlock, edit code. Right, we default to 4. If you want to fly a little faster, add more to that number. And then let's set up like a goal here. What I did was sort of just, I set up this like instead of setting up a pyramid, I'll just make like kind of a, well, I'll just set up one sort of pyramid thing, sort of like yay. And then what I did here was let's actually make one last sort of platform that's a bit more like so. So on this platform, I make this not trigger activating because I'm going to connect a trigger to it, so I kind of don't want to conflate things. Then I'm going to make a trigger, I'm going to make a box, and then I'll draw the box directly on top of it, and then I'll child that trigger to the box that's underneath it. Then I'm going to grab an emitter, I'm going to grab fire. You can draw it anywhere, but right there is pretty good. And I'll drag also the fire by its words to child it to the box. Then I'm going to set the fires, I don't want it burning all the time, so I'm going to set its constant pulse to none because I'm going to emit a burst on my own. And then what I'm going to do is say trigger, edit its on enter code. And when I enter this trigger, I want to say self:get parent node, which gets me my box entity. So this trigger goes up and gets its parent node. And then I can find node by name, which begins to search the children, and I'll search for the one that's named fire. And then on that, I'll call a function that is it's a function of particle emitters, which fire is a particle emitter. So I can say emit burst, and I will emit a burst of 500 fire particles. So if I get an object into here, I will get this sort of success fire. And then lastly, just for just to make it monoscopic instead of my VR stereoscopic, I'm just going to change the outputs here under preferences, edit preferences, HMD. I'm going to add a new screen display to the VR, the HMD camera's display, so it's a screen display output. And what that does is gives you this monoscopic view here. And cool, I've got this ziggurat, and I can select these objects and then kind of try to aim them to go. Oh, I might have failed to get that box entity, box trigger. Let's see what I did wrong there. Almost. Wow. So definitely whatever's going on. I don't think I'm getting success on this spatial trigger. Oh, that explains it. I did not draw it in the right location. It's funny. I drew it as if I was drawing it on top. That explains everything. Since I'm a child of this box entity, I can just double-click these little rollers and it'll zero out. It's obviously pretty large, so I can reshape it. I will make it 2 by 2 by 2. I know that my objects from the beginning are 1 by 1 by 1, and I know that that's sort of buried underneath, so I can bring it up like so. And I can actually just scale this a little bit. That should be fine. Very cool. Okay, so that should do it. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can do with just the basic idea of like selecting an object. And then, you could also, for example, oh? Come on. Give me the fire. There it is. Not bad. So, like I was saying, there's this idea of selecting an object and then doing something with it. I think is pretty awesome. I mean, it's pretty fundamental. Not that it's like it's not a crazy as far as UI goes. It's as simple as what we did to just sort of run the press event. You could also select an object. You can select an object on hover too, right? So we have that on press event where I have to kind of click it, but I could also select it by hovering, right? And then some other function could run on that object, and so you could run the equivalent of the attractor code, but only attract the object that's been selected. So you could kind of just select an object to be suddenly magnetized to a location, right? You could run an animation function, which I think is a really pretty wonderful thing to do. You basically, once you select it, you update and it animates. It says, okay, for you, go over there, go to where the last one is. So that's a fun, challenge for you. Is why not, now that I have the currently selected object, what about selecting the last object? And you could basically animate them to go to one another's positions, different things like that. So nothing crazy here, nothing super fancy, but the effect is kind of just a nice basic setup for some like basic kind of games, or artistic experiences. So enjoy.